get going. All right. Welcome, everyone. We are streaming live on YouTube. Welcome to the March meeting of the Mayor's Task Force on Reimagining Public Safety. Whether you are here with us on the screen or joining us via YouTube or watching the recording later, I'm certainly glad that you are here. And we do have a special guest presentation tonight, Dr. Frank Bumgardner from the Political Science Department of UNC. Welcome, Dr. Bumgardner. We're glad you're with us, and I'll give a little more thorough introduction when your presentation is up, and we can otherwise begin with the roll call.
Judith Alvarado.
Present.
Keith Cook.
I believe Keith was unable to join us tonight.
Sujata Bijou.
Present.
Shannon Blue. Patricia Harrison. Chloe Johnson.
I'm here.
Rod Jones.
Here.
Jason Knapp.
Here.
Tracy Little. Hathaway Pendergrass.
Here.
Hooper Schultz let us know he wouldn't be here tonight. Mark Xavier.
Here.
Allison Zirkle.
Here.
And Mayor Weaver is here, Frank Baumgartner, and Chief Hampton.
Thank you so much. Do we have any audience comments not related to the printed agenda? Sorry.
I'm sorry, was that direct? That was directed to me.
Sorry, yes.
We do not have any comments.
Still getting our groove on. It's all right. Terrific. Well, again, I just want to welcome everyone to this meeting. It always feels like such a long time between our meetings because our conversations have been so robust. But I think this is going to be another meaty conversation. And I also just want to note that under item 6, items for discussion, all of those things will get covered, whether we don't make it to A, B, and C tonight. I just don't want people to think those will be dropped off because I do want to respect everyone's time. But I want us to be sure we talk about the things we need to talk about. So we'll get to everything on the list. Moving on to item 4, items for decision, the minutes from February 11th. Do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
Motion to approve the minutes.
Moved by
Second.
Jason Knapp, seconded by Hathaway Pendergrass. And if we could roll call that as well.
Judith Alvarado. Judith has not indicated she approves.
Sir, I approve.
Sorry, this is one of those things where it has to be kind of formal when we're in the remote meeting where we have to say people's names and get the auditory yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yes.
Sujata Bijou.
Yes.
Chloe Johnson.
Yes.
Rod Jones.
Yes.
Jason Knapp.
Yes.
Hathaway Pendergrass.
Yes.
Mark Xavier.
Yes.
Allison Zirkle.
Yes.
And the minutes from our previous meeting are approved unanimously. And next we come to item number 5, which is our presentation this evening from Dr. Bumgardner. And before I introduce him, I wanted to just lay a very cursory framework for kind of the disparity in the criminal justice system. This is very cursory, but I just wanted to lay a little bit of groundwork to move into this conversation. Across the United States, African Americans are 13% of the population and 35% of the incarcerated. And I want to say right now that I compiled this at our before our last meeting, and I didn't put my citations down. And so even just reading that 13%, I'm suddenly second guessing myself. So, but the point is it's vastly out of proportion to the population. And across the state of North Carolina, African Americans are overrepresented in our state prison system. African Americans constituted 23% of state residents, but 48% of people in jail and 52% of people in prison. Since 1970, the total jail population has increased by 615%. And one of the things that there's some pretty good data on is that, you know, many of these folks are locked up for drug offenses, but Blacks and whites use drugs at very similar rates. So that alone can't explain that disparity. And then in 2009, the North Carolina General Assembly passed the Racial Justice Act, which was based on the disproportionate number of African Americans on death row. And that act resulted in a study sponsored by Michigan State University that showed that in this state, Black people on death row were convicted by all white juries at twice the rate of non-Black defendants. And this goes with a body of research that shows that at every step along the way, from the first contact with law enforcement to sentencing, African Americans are more likely to be arrested, have charges pressed, more likely to be sent to prison, and have those sentences be harsher. And the Racial Justice Act gave people on death row the right to appeal their capital sentence if racial bias could be proved. And then that act was repealed in 2013. The people, well, I'm not going to get into the details. I'll leave it there, but it was repealed in 2013. And then we move on, you know, fast forward to the past year, where we have COVID outbreaks in some of our prisons here in North Carolina and across the country, where, you know, it's very difficult to isolate, and, you know, at the same time have been isolated from loved ones and many of the activities that could, you know, that helps all of us be whole people and could lead down the path towards a better life upon release. And of course, COVID itself disproportionately affected people of color everywhere. And of course, if the prisons are disproportionately filled with people of color, then it's really impacted them inside the prisons as well. And so then we have this database compiled by the State Bureau of Investigation, where every law enforcement agency is required to submit this traffic stop data. And I'm not going to say more about that because that's where my knowledge about that database really ends, other than the playing around with it I have done. But that will bring us to my introduction of Dr. Bumgardner. And this is great on his professional webpage for the university. You've got you can have the short, medium, or long version of the bio. They're all great, but I'm going to read the short one tonight so we can get down to business. Frank Bumgardner holds the Richard R. Richardson Distinguished Professorship in the Department of Political Science at UNC Chapel Hill. He is one of the country's leading scholars of public policy, framing, agenda setting, policy change, and lobbying, and has published extensively on these topics in both the US and comparative perspectives. In recent years, he has focused on statistical studies of criminal justice issues, including the death penalty, racial disparities in traffic stop outcomes, and other issues. His most recent book is Suspect Citizens, focusing on racial differences in the outcomes of routine traffic stops. This book was recognized with the Best Book Award from the Law and Court section of the American Political Science Association in 2019. He is currently working on a number of projects relating to race and criminal justice outcomes, as well as research on a book with Jim Stimson on public opinion and public policy change. And welcome We're so glad you are with us. And at the appropriate time, I believe, Eli, can you give screen sharing to Dr. Bumgardner? So, okay.
Okay, well, thanks so much for having me. And I want to say first, thanks for having this conversation, and thanks to Chief Hampton for being here as well as everyone else. The information I'm going to provide to you, I think, will be troubling and frustrating and difficult to digest. Not only because it's highly statistical, but just because of the subject matter. Race is hard to talk about and racial disparities are hard to confront. But I appreciate your willingness to confront these issues, and we're going to confront them. As you mentioned, I've studied the death penalty, which is kind of the end point of the criminal justice system, and there's incredible racial disparities there. And my work on the traffic stops is, for many of us, it's the entry point to the criminal justice system. 10% of Americans are pulled over every year, almost. North Carolina has 10 million people, and we have sometimes 1.7 million traffic stops per year. So it's the most common interaction that people have with the police. And so I'll talk about that with regards to North Carolina in general. And then, as you know, Hillsborough is a relatively small police department and doesn't conduct that many traffic stops. And so the kind of analysis that I do for the entire state is a little bit less robust for a smaller police department. And so I take that with some grains of salt. I don't want to put too much emphasis on the numbers from any small department. But as you'll see, the numbers that I'm going to present to you put Hillsborough in the broad middle ground of where other towns are across the state. So the issues of racial disparities and traffic stops are not peculiar to Hillsborough, but Hillsborough is not immune from them either. So, so let me, if I can share my screen, I guess that's the easiest, or does you have my slides? I don't know if it's easier for me to do it or.
Might be easier for you just because of forwarding the slides. You should be able to just use the green button at the bottom and share your screen.
Okay, so do you see these slides? Okay, I'm not going to put it in the slideshow mode because that will move it to my other screen, and you won't see what you're supposed to see. So what I'm going to talk about today really relates to this question: what's the purpose of a traffic stop? Should a traffic stop be something where you get a ticket because you broke the speeding rules or you blew through a stop sign, in which case you deserve a ticket and perhaps you deserve a talking to and a warning about how dangerous that kind of activity is? But actually the police throughout the United States over the last several generations have developed a standard practice of using the traffic code as a kind of excuse or a pretext to have a little bit more of an in-depth conversation with the driver at the discretion of the officer if the officer thinks that that might be an interesting conversation. And there's several difficulties with this. One is that anyone driving a car is breaking the law. And if you break the law, like you're either speeding or you're obstructing traffic. Those are the only two options. So you're always breaking a law if you're operating a motor vehicle. And if you add into that the likelihood that you might have expired tags or some kind of technical violation of an equipment requirement, such as a shadow over your license plate or tinted windows that are too tinted, an officer has the option in almost every single case of detaining someone momentarily for a traffic violation. So if you break the law, you're subject to a police investigation. And then that investigation can include a short conversation, interrogatory. And so this has become standard practice throughout the United States. It's validated by the US Supreme Court. The US Supreme Court, of course, has traditionally been made up of people who look like me. And for them, the question has been, well, it's a momentary inconvenience. It should be quite rare that someone would be pulled over for a traffic violation. And it's probably worth it in terms of public safety to give the police the opportunity to conduct short conversations with people. So these are considered valid by the US Supreme Court. Middle-class white Americans are generally exempt from any experience. Even the most remotely related experiences like this seem like foreign territory to middle-class white Americans. But in many minority communities, it's all too common that what appeared to be a simple traffic violation turns into a confrontation and certainly there's stories and YouTube videos and other social media that make people fear that there's going to be a bad outcome from something that should be a routine interaction. The question, though, that really is, I think, at the core of everything with regards to traffic stops is, are we getting a lot of bang for the buck by using the traffic code as an excuse or a pretext to do criminal investigations? And what I want to present to you today is something that suggests that maybe there's not that much mathematical value in using the traffic code the way that has become standard practice throughout the whole United States, okay? So are we gaining a lot in terms of public safety is the real question that I want to pose. And I don't have the answer to that. And I think that's why you're here. And that's why the chief is here. I'm not going to present the answer to that question. That's something for someone else. As was mentioned, I co-authored a book with two of my graduate students, and I can't summarize the whole book, but I could tell you a few highlights. Black drivers are about twice as likely to be pulled over in North Carolina. And once they're pulled over, they're about twice as likely to be searched. So that means a black man getting into a car has 4 times the odds of being searched compared to a white man. The typical contraband hit, which is the purpose of these searches, is to look for contraband. The typical hit is a very small amount. Whatever type of contraband is found, it's usually the smallest unit available on the form that is found of that type of contraband. And only about 10% of searches lead to arrest, because many searches, about 30 to 40% statewide of searches lead to a contraband hit. But most of those don't lead to arrest, because while the officer might register that there was a contraband find, he or she decides not to arrest that person. And we have to conclude from that it was probably because the contraband was a very small amount, or it was drug paraphernalia rather than drugs themselves, or it was a pocket knife rather than a gun, something like that, but it's recorded as contraband. But when we look and see among those cases where there's a contraband hit, fewer than half the cases lead to arrest. So I think that's an important question. The other thing that, in terms of general overview, the disparities were not located just in one community or another. They're everywhere. Every state and locality, every locality across North Carolina, and then when we looked in other states, we find similar things everywhere across the country. So there's nothing special about North Carolina or any particular towns that are especially good or bad with regards to this. This is a nationwide problem. And the targeting seems to be very clearly focused, or it can be understood on the basis of stereotypes, visible stereotypes. So the age of the driver, their gender, their race, the side of town where they are, kind of car they drive, things that are visible cues to the officer are used. Every time we find a new database in some other state that happens to collect another bit of information, such as the neighborhood in Charlotte, we were able to look neighborhood by neighborhood within Charlotte, and the poorer neighborhoods and the neighborhoods with higher minority populations had much higher search rates. So every time we find a new variable, it works with reference to a common stereotype of the criminal profile. And that criminal profile is the poor, Black or brown minority man of color, and the young one in particular. As was mentioned, the state mandates collecting data. North Carolina was the first state in the nation to mandate this in 1999. And it was a mandate that started on July 1st, 2000 for the State Highway Patrol. And then it was expanded to virtually every police department in the state, excluding the smallest police departments only. And it was expanded in 2002. So since January 1st, 2002, we have a comprehensive database of every traffic stop. And you may not be able to read that form, but it has information about the demographics of the driver, the reason why they were pulled over, the outcome of the stop, whether it led to a written warning or a citation or an arrest, whether or not there was a search, and if there was a search, whether or not there was contraband found, and if so, what kind of contraband. It also has information that is almost never filled out about the encountering violence or the use of force. And those things are, quite thankfully, extremely rare in the data. So I haven't even analyzed those. I've summarized them, but I won't talk about them because they're so rare. Very quickly, we compared for every community in North Carolina, the share of white and Black people in the population, and then the share of white and Black people in the traffic stops. And so on the left, you can see that whites represent on average a smaller share of the traffic stops than they represent of the population. And on the right side, they tend to be a higher share of the traffic stops compared to the population, community by community. Now, every time I mention this to a police chief, they'll get upset because a lot of people drive in from neighboring communities, okay? And this is why it's hard to compare. We call this the baseline problem. It is a big problem to know exactly what's the baseline. What are we comparing it to? But in this analysis, we looked at every community in the entire state. So unless the Black people are driving much more than the white people, this suggests a significant disparity throughout the state in the odds that the Black person will be pulled over. We've looked at, by now, over 2,000 different police departments across the country, sometimes the same department in multiple years. But we always find that the ratio of the searching the Black driver is significantly higher than the rate of searching the white drivers. And so this is the distribution, and the line at 1.0 would represent that there was an equity across Black and white drivers would both be searched at the same rate. And you can see that over 1,900 different agencies across the United States, wherever we could find the data, the average is about 2 to 1 or a little bit more than 2 to 1 odds of search for the Black driver compared to the white driver. And there's a few agencies where it's 6 or 7 or 8 to 1. And by the way, those tend to be around Chicago, Illinois, just for information. One of the things that I want to focus on tonight is the difference between what we call safety versus investigatory traffic stops. And let me be clear that I don't have a problem with traffic stops. I have driven enough to know that there's some dangerous drivers, and those people need to be pulled over, and they need to get a finger wag, and they need to get a talking to, and maybe they need to get a ticket, and maybe they need to be arrested for their bad driving, their dangerous driving. But at the same time as we have some dangerous drivers where we need traffic control for people, blowing through red lights, driving fast around school zones, or driving 90 miles an hour down the freeway. We also have a vehicle code and a traffic code that makes every driver breaking the law. And that provides the ultimate discretion for every police officer who can pull over anyone they feel like, anyone they choose. And once they pull someone over, the police officer has the legal right to engage in a conversation and to determine, based on the officer's judgment, whether there's a reason to, maybe declare that there's probable cause that they're harboring drugs or some kind of contraband, or ask for consent to search the vehicle, and essentially use the traffic code as a way to conduct an investigation of the driver. That's what I want to talk about, is the use of the traffic code as a pretext to have a criminal investigation. And when I say criminal investigation, I mean an informal one, just a short conversation with the officer. And that is standard police practice, and it may very well be a very useful police practice, but I want to question that assumption. I think it has been assumed to be useful. So the traffic code makes virtually every driver a miscreant, and therefore the police have discretion. So that's what we really want to look at. The SBI 122 form that I mentioned lists these types of traffic stop purposes. Speed limit violations, you can see that those represent over 40% of all the traffic stops in North Carolina are speed limit violations. Stop sign or stop light violations, 5%. Driving while impaired, very low percentage of all traffic stops, but a very important one. Unsafe movement, which would be swerving or something like that. And then I'm gonna cluster those 4 traffic stop purposes as quote unquote safety related traffic stops. That you're driving badly if you're engaging in one of those. And this is an imperfect categorization that I'm making, but it's the best I can do with the data. And you'll see later that it actually does work. But I would love to be able to get inside the head of the officer and understand, did that officer pull that person over because they made an egregious traffic violation, or did he first try to search for a pretext to find a legal justification to pull the person over for some other reason? And that's the big distinction. So then the investigatory related traffic stops are equipment violations, so the broken taillights. Sometimes those are very serious. It could be broken headlights at night. And if somebody's driving that way, that's a serious safety violation. So this is why I want to say up front that this is an imperfect categorization system. Regulatory traffic stops relate to expired tags. So it's very related to poverty. And you can see that 17%, 3.5 million traffic stops have occurred during the time of data collection that relate to regulatory violations. Seatbelt. Investigation is a category that obviously is confusing because I call these all investigatory, but an investigation is when there might be a warrant for the arrest of somebody. Okay, so that's an important distinction to keep in mind. And then I want to mention that we're not going to analyze checkpoint stops, because checkpoint stops in the data collection procedure are not recorded unless something adverse occurs to the driver. So we only know the cases where they get arrested or searched or something if it's a checkpoint. Other people are passed through without anything recorded. So I'm not going to analyze those. So when we wrote our book in 2018, we had these data through 2016. We've updated it now. But anyway, it's millions and millions of traffic stops. I'll try to go quickly through this. The total number of traffic stops is between 1 million per year and 1.7 million per year. It is quite surprising, perhaps, on how much that varies from year to year, because that's a 70% difference. It's a huge difference in the rate or the number of traffic stops. And then somewhere between about 50% of the traffic stops are safety related, and about 50% are what I've called investigatory. And it varies a little bit over time, but it's roughly around 50%. Most traffic stops lead to a warning. A very large number of traffic stops lead to a ticket or citation. Actually, citation may be the most common now that I think of it. And about 3% of all traffic stops lead to a search of the vehicle or the driver. That's what I want to focus on. That is a very strong sign that the officer views the driver with suspicion of criminal activity. And remember, if you turn right into the second lane of traffic, that's unsafe movement. But searching your car is not going to help the officer figure out why you turned right illegally, why you made an illegal right turn. So searching the car is usually unrelated to the purpose of the traffic stop, except in drunk driving cases. In drunk driving cases, DUI, almost everybody gets searched automatically. And the search rates are very high, and the contraband hit rates are also very high in DUI cases, but those are less than 1% of all traffic stops. So searches are about 3%, but you can see here that the search rate for white drivers is quite low. Search rate for black drivers is a little bit over twice the rate for white drivers. But this is made up of two different kinds of search rates. For safety related searches, the white drivers only have a 1% search rate, and black drivers have about a 1.6% rate. But for investigatory related stops, white drivers have a relatively similar and very low rate of search, but black drivers have a particularly high rate of search. So the bias or the disparity across race comes particularly in these investigatory traffic stops. I think that many of them are related to poverty, having expired tags, having equipment violations many times are related to issues of poverty. And so they correlate with race. So while the overall ratio of searches for black drivers compared to white drivers is 2.6, it's only 1.5 for safety related traffic stops. That's, for example, speeding violations. And it's 2.7 with regards to investigatory traffic stops. So I think it's an important question. If the investigatory traffic stops are driving the racial disparities that we observe, then we should ask the question, are we getting a lot of public safety benefit from what's generating this racial disparity? So we make a measure for every police department in the state about the share of their traffic stops that are targeted on investigatory purposes versus safety purposes. And I just want to show you quickly a few findings. As we move towards the right on these graphs, there's that police department is doing more investigatory stops, more equipment violations, more regulatory violations, that's expired tags, broken taillights, and proportionately fewer stop sign violations, drunk driving, or speeding. So the black drivers end up with a higher rate of search compared to white drivers to the extent that we emphasize investigations. They also get more warnings. You might think that that's nice to get a warning. You know, that's a good outcome from a traffic stop. But if it's only a verbal warning or a warning in any type of warning, it might raise the question, why did it get pulled over in the first place? If the violation was not serious enough to get a ticket, maybe I shouldn't have been pulled over. And lo and behold, we find that black drivers get more tickets than white drivers when the police departments emphasize investigations. They get fewer tickets, they get fewer tickets, suggesting that maybe they weren't really engaging in a serious violation of the law, okay? But they get arrested more. So they get searched more, they get warned more, they get fewer tickets, but they get arrested more to the extent that that police department focuses more on investigations. So what can we understand about this? I think that police officers follow the lead of their agencies, and they understand through professional norms that they have the legal justification to pull over anyone they want. because everybody is breaking the law. If everybody is breaking the law, then the police can pick and choose which people to choose to enforce the law. And that's where we see the actions of implicit bias and sometimes systemic bias. And I want to say particularly that it doesn't have to be related to an individual decision by an individual officer. It could be an institutional decision by the police department, for example, to say, well, this side of town or this neighborhood or this intersection deserves more intensive police oversight than some other part of town. And that might be related to some traffic or crime statistics, but it also might generate two different kinds of policing, much more aggressive policing activities in certain neighborhoods and less aggressive activities in other neighborhoods, even if no officer is engaging in any kind of racial profiling on the individual level at all whatsoever. It could be driven either from that individual level behavior by an officer or an institutional systemic decision based on precincts or neighborhoods or patrol districts or something like that. I want to mention a little bit about probable cause searches and consent searches. Those are two of the main reasons why, or mechanisms by which people get searched. A consent search, of course, is when the officer has no probable cause, but is interested in searching your car, and he says he has to ask you if it's okay if he searches your pockets or your belongings or your car. And if you say, yes, that is okay, or if you refuse to say no, then you've just given your permission, you've given your consent to a search, which is and it's your constitutional right to refuse to give that consent. It is an important reform that a lot of cities have undertaken to mandate a written form that the driver will sign before giving their consent. And usually, for example, in the case in Durham, that form lays out your constitutional right to refuse to give your signature. And in the place where you do give your signature, you also give the password to your cell phone. So I think most people get the idea that this will be a very intrusive search and nobody signs the form. So that's a very useful reform. But as you'll see later, Hillsborough has already enacted the equivalent. There's very few consent searches in the Hillsborough Police Department. But statewide, search rates have gone down quite dramatically from about 4% to 2.5% statewide. And those have in particular been driven by big declines in consent searches. Whether we look at the number of consent searches or the percent of traffic stops that lead to consent searches are becoming much less common. On the other hand, probable cause searches are being substituted statewide. This is kind of a problem, I think, because you shouldn't be able to make up the difference between, there should be a legal justification between consent and probable cause. But it does appear that as consent searches are declining, officers throughout the state are substituting probable cause searches, apparently. Policing and everything about criminal justice is very highly gendered. So I want to make sure that we distinguish between males and females. And so you can see on the left, search rates for Black and white women, and on the right, search rates for Black and white male drivers. And the differences, the racial differences are much higher for the men than for the women. And also the search rates are much higher for the men. You can see on the scale. For the women, it's like between 1% and 2%. And for the men, it's between 0% and 8%. So for men, it's much higher rates of search and then a much higher racial distinction in those searches. And that's consistent throughout the country. So the racial disparity, the ratio between the search rate for Blacks and whites is not very high for women. The racial differences are not that great among female drivers, but they're quite substantial among male drivers. And this tells me, and this is a problem for a small department like Hillsborough because there's just not that many traffic stops. It is very instructive, though, to limit one's analysis of traffic stops data only to the men. If you're interested in finding the racial disparities, the disparities are going to be there much more strongly among the men than among the women, because in the criminal profile, or the stereotype that's used within the criminal justice, profession or law enforcement, it's men. Okay, so it's a very male thing. We see the very sharp declines in consent searches over time across the state for both blacks and whites. And this is among men. But the probable cause searches among black men have shot up quite dramatically, whereas the probable cause searches for white men have gone up only very modestly. So the white men saw I think you could see in both cases a substitution effect. But for the white men, it's moving from 2% down to about 1%, roughly speaking, in consent searches, and a roughly similar increase in probable cause searches. But for black men, it's a much more substantial difference and substantial increase in probable cause. We can look at how many of these searches lead to contraband. And as we've seen the search rates decline, the contraband hit rates have gone up correspondingly. And I want to introduce a concept of like the threshold of suspicion. That is, can you smell drugs on the person before you decide to search them? That's a high threshold of suspicion. Or do you just not like the way that that person is dressed? That's a low threshold of suspicion. And apparently, as we've cut down on the number of searches, the threshold of suspicion has gone up because the contraband hit rates have also increased quite substantially. And I just want to raise this question of whether it's worth it. And like I mentioned, I don't have an answer to the question, but I do want to make sure that that's where the conversation goes. And our police chief here in Chapel Hill, describes it this way: is the juice worth the squeeze? If you're going to alienate somebody by telling him to empty his pockets and to detain him for another 15 minutes on the side of the road, maybe it's raining or maybe he's late to work, and you're going to make him later to work and potentially lose his job, and there's going to be an adverse consequence to that young man for this activity, you should be pretty confident you're going to get something out of it, other than merely alienating the person, because you're definitely going to alienate the person. And so the question is, are we getting a lot of public safety benefit for these activities? Now, the US Supreme Court has consistently said that there is no cost to a fruitless search, that any American citizen should be willing, for the sake of public safety, to undergo a momentary inconvenience once every 10 years. But I want to tell you that I haven't been pulled over in the last 25 years of driving. And you can tell what I look like. But Philando Castile was pulled over, I think, 47 times before one traffic stop finally led to his fatal encounter, his last traffic stop. Now, there's a million differences between me and Philando Castile in terms of social class and maybe how we drive. I don't know, maybe he wasn't a good driver. But I don't think he was such a bad driver that it would justify that level of interaction with the police. It was something else. He fit a criminal profile, a stereotype of a profile that I don't fit. So that's I think the issue that we really want to raise is there a way for police professionals to incorporate into their way of thinking, and maybe they already do, that we're going to take a little chip out of the fabric of democracy right now when we act with aggression when we enforce the law. Law enforcement is inherently, it can be confrontational, and sometimes it needs to be, but sometimes it doesn't need to be. And every time that it generates a feeling among that person who's being confronted that they're more of a suspect than they are a citizen. And so we have to really be careful about how we decide to do that. Are we getting some bang for the buck? Okay. I want to mention a couple things specifically about Hillsborough and then open up for questions. Hillsborough has, I guess, was not required to report before 2015. The earliest data that I saw came from December 2014, because Hillsborough is at that threshold of a smaller department that maybe wasn't required to report before. But anyway, in my database, it appears only December 2014. So I started these trends just from 2015, and I updated it most recently at the end of 2019. So I haven't incorporated the data from 2020, but you can see a couple thousand searches, 1,000 to 1,500 searches of white traffic stops on the left, and 500 to 700, 800 traffic stops of black drivers. And then you can see the numbers of searches, maximum number of 125 searches in a year. So it's really not huge numbers. Probable cause searches and consent searches, you can see very, very low numbers of consent searches on the left at the bottom. And then on the right-hand side, the rate per 100 traffic stops, how many lead to a consent search or a probable cause search, a maximum of about 5% in 2017, probable cause searches, 5% of traffic stops led to a probable cause search, and 1.5% to 1% leading to a consent search. So very low numbers of searches. But still pretty substantial racial disparities in those searches, even though there's not huge numbers of them. Black drivers are subjected to much higher rates of search, or significantly higher rates of search than white drivers, which again is very consistent with what we see in other communities throughout the state or in other states. I want to mention on this probable cause and consent that the probable cause search rate, was 15% for black drivers. I think this is black male drivers, 15%. And it was 5% overall. So it was 3 times higher for those black male drivers in 2017. So that's 15% search rate is a pretty significant search rate. For female drivers, they're quite low search rates. And then similarly to what we saw for the statewide data, the ratio of the racial disparity ratio, the black-white search rate ratio is much higher, consistently above 2 to 3, sometimes even above 4 for black males compared to white males, and not very high and not very consistent for female drivers. Overall, across all the years of data that I was able to analyze for Hillsborough through the SBI form, there was about 10,000 traffic stops, only 367 searches. From those searches, I found 143 contraband hits. And from those 143 contraband hits that followed from a search, I found 70 arrests. Now, there were other contraband hits, but the officer who found them didn't say that they searched the person. So I'm not sure how they found the contraband. And there were other arrests, but if I can believe the form, which is subject to error, we've got 70 contraband. We've got 70 arrests derived from contraband, deriving from searches out of 10,000 traffic stops. And so I think the question is, that's kind of a needle in the haystack kind of proposition. And the question is it making us safer? And again, I don't have the answer to that, but I think that's a good thing for you guys to talk about. I want to give you 3, I'm a professor, so I'm going to give you some bibliographical references. One obviously is my book, but I'll show you the photos of 3 others. And these are the descriptions. Sarah Seo is a law professor, and her book is about how our legal expectations of privacy changed when the car was invented. It's a very interesting discussion about the 1920s. And the Supreme Court was posed with this question: is your car more like the sidewalk, or is it more like your home? And they decided that it's more like the sidewalk. You can't have the same expectations of privacy in your car like you might have in your home. And that was a big legal decision, or kind of a transformation of the understanding of privacy. So that's a very interesting book. Gretchen Soren's book, Driving While Black, is also a PBS documentary that I would recommend. And it's about the Jim Crow era, where public transportation, buses and trains, was segregated. So for African Americans, cars were a big deal. Very important transformation in their ability to move about the country or move about their communities. And so it's a very important thing in the Black community. And she presents it in a way that I hadn't previously really understood. Epp, in this book, Pulled Over, they make the distinction between safety and investigatory traffic stops. They call them pretextual traffic stops. And they interview drivers about their experiences and really explain how it makes people feel. And then I want to mention one Supreme Court decision by the Oregon Supreme Court, which is irrelevant in North Carolina, but it's very interesting. It was based on the Oregon Constitution. But it threw out a drug conviction on the basis that the officer had pulled over the driver for making an illegal right turn. So that's when you turn right into the second lane of traffic rather than into the lane next to the curb. So that's a technical violation, but most of us do it all the time. But it is illegal, and it's a good example of the kind of things that we can't really avoid doing, or that's routinely done by otherwise law-abiding citizens. But it gives the legal pretext or the legal justification for the officer to pull that person over. And once the person was pulled over, the officer in this case testified that, as in every case, he started a conversation about whether the driver had any drugs in the car, or had any weapons or other kinds of contraband, or was engaged in any kind of illegal activity. And the Supreme Court ruled it illegal because whether or not that person had drugs would probably not help the officer understand why he turned into the second lane of traffic, which was the legal justification for the stop in the first place. And so I think it's a really interesting way to think about prohibiting the use of the traffic code as a fishing expedition. The traffic code can be used and is routinely used as a fishing expedition by law enforcement nationwide, and it's a well-established practice. And it doesn't affect me. It never happens to me. It doesn't happen to white middle-class people, but it happens a lot to people like Philando Castile, okay? So this Supreme Court decision in one state, put an end to it in that state, or at least aims to do that. And that's all I want to mention to you. I hope I haven't gone on too long, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much. That was really terrific. And as with similar information this group has been asked to digest, I am guessing we will have questions that we might not think of today. So appreciate that offer for the follow-up. Mm-hmm. Do you want to drive for the Q&A, or would you prefer me to call on folks and you answer?
Why don't you call on people, because you probably know the people better. And
no problem.
Mm-hmm.
So if folks have questions, then just give me a signal and I'll start calling on folks. Well, maybe I'll go ahead and ask one, and just to get
yes.
things. Oh, you ready, Mark? Go for it.
Yeah, I have a question though, because, well, I have many questions. But let me, show my face here. I have many questions, right? But to me, there is something that you mentioned several times, and it resonates, and it's kind of, it's kind of a big elephant in the room type of thing. So here's my question. Here it is. You mentioned poverty several times, right? And my question is to you is that I'm sure, by writing with the book, etc., you may come across that you might have, dug in deeper into, what is, maybe it's not in the book, maybe it is, I don't know. What is the relationship between poverty and the traffic stops, right? And then you also mentioned that it's more related to the middle class, and upper class is actually not part. Well, it is part of the data, but compared to the lower class, it is higher, right? So my question to you is, what is the role of, I would say, poverty into the traffic stop? I mean, you brush into it a little bit. If you can go a little bit deeper into that, I would really appreciate it.
Well, I think poverty, when the traffic stop is, as I mentioned, what I'm interested in traffic stop is when it diverts into a kind of informal criminal investigation, where the driver is made to be aware that the officer is treating them as someone who may potentially be involved in crime. And I remember I often use a video that comes from the state of Texas. It's from a dash cam video from the Texas Highway Patrol. And it's cases where there was accusations against them of racial profiling. And one of them is they pulled over a young Hispanic man who turned out to be totally innocent of any wrongdoing. And he was actually a city councilman in his hometown, a small town in Texas. And at the end of the detention on the side of the highway, the trooper explains to him that, he really didn't have any suspicion of him, but, we see a lot of bad things out here, and we see drugs and guns and kidnapped children. And he went on with this long list of things that they unfortunately experienced. And it was very clear that that man was being considered as a suspect for kidnapping children, or they were looking through his vehicle trying to find things. And so there's a point when a traffic stop becomes an investigation to see if you're involved in criminal activity. As I mentioned, I think we need to have traffic stops. They don't need to divert into criminal investigations necessarily. Every time we can separate out the poverty effect from the race effect, we find that they add on to each other. They don't substitute for each other. It's not that race is just a proxy for poverty. Rather, I've had a few opportunities using other data sets where we could at least get some kind of estimate of poverty. One is, how old is your car? That's a commonly available thing. Another is, what kind of car is it? Is it a Lexus or a Tesla, or is it a deuce and a quarter? I'm from Detroit, so we used to call those deuce and a quarter. Or, is it a Chevrolet? Is it an expensive car? Or is it an inexpensive car? Is it a new car, or is it an old car? And when we look at these proxies for poverty, we find that they add on to race. They don't substitute for race. Poor white people suffer, but poor Black and brown people suffer more. And young men suffer 3 and 4 times more from these stereotypes. And in the city of Charlotte, we were able to do it another way because we had data about the patrol districts or neighborhoods of the city of Charlotte. And we had 2 years of traffic stops data from Charlotte. And similarly, when we looked in the neighborhoods that were the most white neighborhoods versus those that had the highest Black population, or we looked at the wealthiest neighborhoods versus the poorest neighborhoods, we found vastly different rates of search. And then they didn't substitute for the racial effect, they added on to the racial effect. So I think we definitely have poverty related things going on, but it would be, I want to caution everybody from thinking that that's a substitute for race, or that that's the reason why we see the race effect. We see the poverty effect, and we see the race effect, and we see the age effect, and we see the gender effect. Does that address your question, Mark?
Yes, perfect. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah. I can tell you also, in a paper we did about Charlotte, we had information about the identity of the officer. And that was very interesting and rare, because North Carolina doesn't collect that information systematically, although we know the ID number of the officers, but we don't know who they are. But in Charlotte, they published that, and they had the race and gender of the officer and the years of service. And it turns out that the white male police officers had much higher rates of search of all drivers than either the female officers or the male officers of color. And the effect of the race and identity of the officer was almost as great as the effect of the race and gender of the driver. So it was really a substantial effect. So there's Black officers are much less likely to search any kind of driver than white officers, but they maintain the stereotype of the criminal suspect. They're still more likely to search the young Black men. Even the Black officers are more likely to do so, but they're less likely to search anybody. So the entire thing is drawn down. They're much less aggressive in their behaviors, is how I interpreted that from their search rates. And the white male officers are much more likely to search. Female officers, similarly, much less likely to use those tactics. But all the officers still had the same kind of stereotypical targeting of the young Black men or the young brown men. So it was that was the only time I was able to look at the identity of the officer, and it was a relatively small study, but it's still very interesting.
Thank you. Thanks for your question, Mark. Next, I see that Hathaway has a question, and then after Hathaway, Sujatu.
Good evening, Dr. Bumgardner. It's great to see you. I really appreciate you giving us this info. Anytime that I can get my hands on your data, your expertise, I try to soak it in, so I appreciate it. And Mark, I had a question, but also to kind of go off on what Mark was saying as well as to the poverty issue. Dr. Bumgardner really described it well when he was talking about the types of stops and the type of regulatory stops. If you think about it, to get your car registered, you also have to have your car inspected, and you also have to pay your tax now. So that bill that you get, it's a percentage based upon the value of your car, you have to pay that. And if you don't pay that and your car's out, you're literally driving something that's a driving violation of the statute. So it's illegal to operate your vehicle at that time, like that specific vehicle. And that might be $200, that might be $100, maybe $500, depending on the value of your car, who knows. But my question for Dr. Bumgardner is, you mentioned the counties, the municipalities, the police departments that are using the consent pieces of paper when officers pull over folks. And I remember when that first started, I remember Carborough was doing it. I think, I'm not sure if Chapel Hill was doing it.
Yeah.
When you mentioned Hillsborough was doing it as well. Do you know how many
Hillsborough's not doing the written consent. They're not doing the written consent form. I misspoke if that was what I said there, but they do have a relatively low rate of consent searching in general. It's not very many consent searches, as I showed you, but I don't know that there's a form for it. There's Durham, And I think Asheville recently enacted the reform, and Fayetteville. But there's not that many cities in the state that have this form. The biggest ones are Fayetteville and Durham. But Chapel Hill and Carrboro have them. There's only 20 consent searches per year in Hillsborough, so it's not that big of a deal.
But in those bigger cities, the Durham, the Fayetteville, the Asheville, the data is showing that the search rate is drastically decreasing with those new forms. Is that what your data showing?
Consent searches in Fayetteville went down by 98%.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they did not substitute in Fayetteville. There was not a substitution effect with the corresponding increase in probable cause. However, in Durham, when it was mandated by the city council, I'm pretty confident that the police leadership was hostile to the reform under Chief Lopez, and they substituted. And as a matter of fact, the overall search rate increased. They more than substituted. So I think that we have to be careful about the police leadership buy-in to any kinds of reforms, because that's the example in Durham was a real cautionary tale. You know, implementation really matters, and these reforms will be implemented by police officers who work within a police department, and it's got leadership, and so that leadership has to buy in. So the leadership in Fayetteville seriously bought into these reforms, and then in Durham it was very controversial. And then Chief Lopez retired, and he was replaced by a new chief, and I think that things changed, and the consent searches did decline, and the probable cause searches then did decline back to where they had been before. So I think the police leadership really matters. A police chief who's hostile to a new reform can scuttle the reform. That was my conclusion from looking at that case in Durham. But then the city manager has the authority to replace the police chief, which is what happened in Durham. So eventually things worked out the way the city council wanted it to, but it was hostile, and it was some big politics, and it was some confrontations, because these things are not easy. And of course, and I don't want to overstate the importance of traffic stops in policing. You know, police do a lot of things, and traffic stops are just one of them. So, but I think they do reflect something, and we do have some pretty good numbers on the racial differences in traffic stops. Because traffic stops were not the only issue that was going on with the Durham Police Department. This was around 2013. I put on the website associated with my book, I put a copy of the form that the Durham Police Department has for consent searches. I don't know that it's relevant to Hillsborough because there's not that many consent searches, but it is interesting to read the form because it does ask for the password to your cell phone. And it does clearly indicate that you don't need to sign this form. And if you don't sign the form, there'll be no consequence and you'll be free to go. So nobody signs the form.
That makes sense. Sujata, go ahead.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you, Dr. That was a lot of interesting information that you packed into a short time. So thank you for that. I have a couple of questions. One of them is you showed a histogram early on about showing the ratio of Black to white traffic stops. I think it was early on in your presentation. Yeah. And I noticed that there were a few percentages that were under the one mark. And I was wondering if you can tell us about anything about those and if there's anything we could learn from them.
Well, what I showed was a histogram, the distribution of search rates, the difference in the search rates between white and black drivers. So not traffic stops, but the search rates resulting from them. And the average was about 2.7 or so. and it drifted way out to the right, where in the Chicago area, there were some cases of 6, 7, and 8 times to 1 higher rates of search. But as you mentioned, there were a couple that drifted off to the left. And I looked at those, and they tended to be smaller departments where I think it was some flukiness. I think that what's really of interest, I didn't see any obvious patterns of what was causing or what those departments at the left-hand side of that scale had in common. I think they tended to be small departments where it was a little bit fluky, but I could say that I think it was over 99% of the observations are to the right of the number 1. So it's ubiquitous, you know, it's virtually any police department. For example, in Ferguson, Missouri, when the U.S. Department of Justice did their investigation of the Ferguson Police Department, they looked at traffic stops among many other things. But the ratio of white to black to white searches was 1.7 in Ferguson. So 70% more likely for the black driver to be searched than the white driver. Well, my ratio statewide is 2.16. So Ferguson, Missouri would be less than average for the state of North Carolina. That's not to say that Ferguson is doing great, because they have a 70% disparity. So my point is just that this is a nationwide problem of racial disparities in police encounters. If we look at traffic stops, you know, we see these data and they're everywhere. It's almost everywhere. You're right to point out that there were a few cases where it was right at 1 or even a little bit less than 1. But it's a nationwide problem. It's not limited to the city of Charlotte or city of Hillsborough or any particular town or community. It's pretty much everywhere. Now, why is it? I think there's $2 million questions. Why is it? And then are we gaining something from it? Like, are we keeping the community safer by being more aggressive in our policing on a certain side of town? I mean, I've been to some pretty charged meetings or community meetings with moms talking about their 16, 17-year-old sons trying to walk to high school. And they live in what the police describe as a high crime area. And if you live in a high crime area and your high school is in a high crime area about a mile away, and you have to walk in front of some high crime known drug distribution centers, AKA the McDonald's parking lot, and you have to walk by there on your way to school every morning, and you have a backpack and you're 16 and you have baggy pants, that's a problem. And those mothers were getting really tired of it. And so I think we do have to really look at these things really seriously and think about, on the one hand, maybe there are some people engaged in crime, but on the other hand, there's a lot of people who are not engaged in crime, who, when we treat them as a criminal suspect, they get alienated. And, you know, I don't have any problem alienating people who are serious criminals, you know, but alienating innocent people is a problem. If it's done, you know, I mean, I'm sure that police officers don't have a crystal ball and they can't tell who's involved in a crime and who's not. But when it's done in a racially disparate manner, and it's 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 more likely, and then every time I find a database that has another stereotypical indicator, you know, like, do you drive a Lexus or do you drive a Chevrolet? The people that drive the Lexus benefit. How old is your car? The people that drive the new car get a benefit. They're less likely to be treated as a suspect. And so these things are quite clearly systematic and very, very disproportionate. So I think it is worth asking, you know, we know that we have these disparities. They're quite substantial. They're not limited, and I always try to be careful. I'm not putting the blame on any particular police agency. It's a cultural issue, much bigger than just any police department, any police chief. But are we getting any bang for that buck? Are we being kept safer? Are we finding, distributions of drugs or caches of guns that are coming into the community? Or are we just finding the residue of some pot that was smoked the previous week in that vehicle, and then not even arresting the young man? Then if that's the case, then we're not getting the bang for the buck, and we're getting the alienation without the public safety benefit. So that's the part that I just want to add to the conversation. And like I said, I don't have the answer to it, but I think that we're not even asking the question.
Chloe, and then Jason.
The discussion about the signing for consent, that reform, was really fascinating. I guess we couldn't call it a success if the impacts were just shifted to another area. But I'm curious if you, in speaking to police departments and with other policymakers, have seen any reforms that address the higher number of investigatory stops that have been successful in some way, or just some creative ideas about how to change the disparity between investigatory and safety stops.
The book that I mentioned by Charles Epp called Pulled Over is the book that really makes this distinction the most cleanly. And that's based on an interviews with thousands of people who were pulled over. And they say that people who are caught going 85 miles an hour in a 55 zone are unhappy to be pulled over, but they understand that they deserved it. People who pull into the second lane of traffic when they make a right-hand turn, and then the officer says, "I pulled you over for illegal right turn. By the way, do you have any guns in the car?" They know that they've just been profiled. And if they don't have a gun in the car, which is most likely, they resent the questioning, and also the pretextual nature of the traffic stop, because they probably didn't create a hazard with the illegal right turn. That would be a different question. So there has been, in our book, we have a chapter about the city of Fayetteville that went through not only the reform about written consent search forms, but also a decision by the police chief to dramatically reduce the percent of investigatory traffic stops, and to really focus on speeding, drunk driving, and stop sign violations, and real unsafe movement. I mean, really you as a police chief, I think you can tell your officers to, don't pull people over for pretext, and just pull people over for actual traffic safety hazards. And I think the officers would understand what that means. As that translates into the data, there's some limitations, but Fayetteville did that. And he also encouraged officers to don't use the traffic code as an excuse to do criminal investigations, reduce the searches. So it led to a dramatic reduction in investigatory stops. Also a big reduction in the racial disparity in the searches that resulted from the stops, because they weren't using the stop to conduct a search. They just weren't doing very many searches. And they didn't use the traffic stop as a way to do more searches. They just did it as a way to keep the road safe from bad drivers. And lo and behold, people in the minority communities in Fayetteville started making more 911 calls, and the crime rate went down, and people started to trust the police a little bit more. Because if there's a sense that the police are unfair, then when people who live in what are referred to as high crime neighborhoods, which is poor neighborhoods and minority dominated neighborhoods, They often need the police, but they're often unwilling to call the police because they might not trust the police. And so it's like a terrible tragedy and a paradox. And so Chief Medlock, who did this reform in Fayetteville, really focused on that, and we were able to demonstrate that it had some serious success. He was anxious to reduce the number of fatal traffic accidents. And I think he did a good job of that, although there was a 4-death accident at the end of 1 year, and he didn't make the numbers that he was hoping to make. But I think that focusing on speeding, targeting law enforcement around certain intersections where there's a lot of accidents, and focusing on actual keeping the roads safe was his goal with traffic stops, rather than using the vehicle code and the traffic code as an excuse to fight the war on drugs. That's the part where I think we get into the racial disparities. You know, people running through red lights, you know, they need to get a ticket. Maybe they need to be arrested. Maybe they need to be given a breathalyzer. You know, that's dangerous driving. But some guy on the poor side of town who makes an illegal right turn or doesn't fully come to an absolute stop at a stoplight, you don't need to investigate about whether he's carrying a gun. But that has been the common strategy throughout American policing since the 60s. And the reason I think that it's gone on might be that it works, but more likely, it doesn't affect me, doesn't affect people who look like me. So there's been no political backlash against it. So I think that's the politics of it. So it's been allowed to continue with no kind of oversight. And we haven't asked, and I don't actually have the answer to this question. Has it been effective? That question hasn't been posed. So I think that's definitely a question that needs to be posed. And I don't know what my response would be if someone came back and said, well, we have a racially disparate practice, but it keeps us all safer, so we're going to keep it. I think we won't be faced with that, because I think what we'll have is the parts of this practice that are generating the racially disparate outcomes actually are not keeping us safer. I have two colleagues, one in the law school and one in my department, who published a paper about the war on drugs and in a law review recently, and it was called "Searching for Sharks, but Finding Only Minnows." And it's the idea that a lot of the law enforcement justification in the war on drugs has been finding, you know, major distributors of drugs. But when you look at the numbers of people who get arrested, it's very small fish. It's not the big players, it's the small fish coming in very large numbers. So the justification that we're gonna, you know, crack down on drug kingpins is the justification. It's very politically popular, but actually what we're gonna do is get a lot of 18-year-old young men who are by no means kingpins. So anyway, I just want to throw that out there. I mean, and the traffic code is a big part of this, although that's not most of what the traffic stops are. Only 3% of traffic stops lead to a search. So it's, you know, most traffic stops are speeding tickets. And, you know, by all means, we need to give speeding tickets to more people, in my opinion. But using the traffic code as a way to fight the war on drugs is, I think, where we see these racial disparities and the poverty disparities. And we don't have any evidence about whether we're getting a lot of bang for the buck.
I'd love to jump in and ask one of my questions, which is something else that you mentioned several times that just to help me conceptually understand something you were talking about. When you said every person, the code is written so that every person driving a vehicle is breaking the law. Can you just say what, I'm not quite following whether that's because sooner or later, everybody breaks a traffic law when you're driving, or what does that mean?
Well, you should read the code. You'd be surprised what's illegal. But I mean, if the car is moving and you're not moving as fast as the speed limit, the officer could say you're obstructing traffic.
Okay.
If you go past the speed limit, you're speeding. But you know and I know that almost everybody speeds all the time. And very few people get pulled over. And as a matter of fact, the traffic moves usually at above the speed limit. And people are not being arrested or pulled over or given citations for that. So, and that's even before, that's just thinking about speeding. And, you know, people don't come to full stops at stop signs. Certainly the illegal right turn is I think an officer's favorite, because it's if it's a 4-lane road, lots of people turn automatically into the second lane of traffic. That's illegal. And then that's the traffic. I mean, the traffic code, the vehicle code is a whole other thing, which is if you have a crack on your windshield, it's illegal to drive the car. Or, you know, you have a crack on your brake light. It's a violation. And then so many people, as was mentioned, have regulatory problems, you know, that their tags are expired. So, yeah, pretty much you can count on, if you're driving a car, a police officer has the legal authority to pull you over, which is quite different than if you're walking down the sidewalk. And that's why the book that I mentioned by CEO, I can't remember her first name, Sally CEO, is so interesting. Sarah CEO, Policing the Open Road. She talks about how the law was changed when cars became common. And it's just fascinating to think about, you know, before there were cars, you know, you had a cart and a buggy, or a horse and a buggy, or you had a bicycle, or you were a pedestrian. And as a pedestrian walking down the street, you have a certain expectation of privacy from a police officer. But that privacy is because you're not breaking any laws by walking down the street or the sidewalk. But if you're driving a car, you're breaking some law. And so then you have no further expectation of privacy, because if you're engaging in illegal activity, the police can arrest you. So anyone driving a car is subject to arrest, or, you know, detention, momentary detention on the side of the road, being pulled over. And once you're in that momentary detention, there can be a conversation. And then that conversation, at the option of the officer, can go towards, you don't have any guns in the car, do you? Or if it's me, it might be, do you need directions to get home because you look lost? Or the officer can be extremely helpful. I mean, I have never had any adverse interactions with the police officer, you know, so I'm just talking about the rare cases, but, you know, for people in minority communities, they're not that rare. But they are, you know, I don't want to overemphasize the idea that every traffic stop leads to a catastrophe or some civil rights violation. That's not the case at all. It's just when we use the traffic stop as an excuse to do an investigation where I think we get into the disparate outcomes. You know, the other way to think about this is to say, well, let's take all of those resources and all that time that's used in these routine traffic stops in a kind of needle in the haystack kind of strategy of, maybe if we ask 10,000 people if they're carrying a gun, that we'll find a couple guns. You know, that's the needle in the haystack strategy that I think has been common. Take those resources and hire some detectives and actually do some detective work and find the criminals and arrest them. That's the other strategy. I'm not trying to suggest we should lighten up on crime. I'm just trying to suggest that we have to count as a error when we fruitlessly hassle innocent people because of their appearance. That's not good for democracy. You know, that's not good for the fabric of social life. You know, it's not good for making people feel that they're citizens. And I'd be happy to see police departments hire more detectives and do more undercover work and try to find some actual criminals and arrest them. It's fine. It's the needle in the haystack. Use the traffic code as a way to show that you're watching. That's where we get into the race, class, gender, identity disparities. And then it doesn't really work because we're not catching that many drug kingpins. We're catching a lot of drug minnows. I'm mixing my metaphor, but we're catching a lot of small fish rather than big fish.
Jason had a question.
Yeah, so I was just wondering specifically about the disparities in the data between Hispanic communities and white communities. Do you have any info on that?
Yeah, we have a lot of information about it. But in the Hispanic community, you know, there's a different dynamic. There's two things happening with regards to young Hispanic men. One is the exact same thing that's happening to the young black men. This is the criminal profile, and they're subjected to the exact same kinds of targeting as young black men. But there's an entirely separate issue happening in the Hispanic community, which is immigration checking. And that's unrelated to your age, and it's unrelated to your gender. And so it's much more like you can't grow out of it. Like when you become a middle-aged man, you're not exempt from that immigration status hassling potentially. And women are just as likely to be subjected to it as men. Whereas those things are not true when it's about the criminal profile. That's a young man, and it's a young man of color, and it's a poor young man of color. But the other thing I have to say in our data, the best thing that we came up with as an indicator of suspicion was the decision of the officer to search your car. So that works really well for the issue of the criminal profile, but it doesn't work well for the immigration status question, because you don't have to search the car in order to investigate the person's immigration status. So we don't have the best data on that question. But we did try to explore it. And I know that the other thing that happens in the Hispanic community is lots of people drive without a proper license, and they get arrested. And I think it costs about $300 to deal with that ticket. And so the issue of expunctions, or, you know, just how to deal. And again, this is a little bit of a different dynamic. It's not about searching people and, you know, treating them as a criminal suspect. But it is pulling people over because you want to see if they have their proper papers. And again, I mean, people could say, well, it's dangerous to the community to have people who aren't licensed drivers driving cars. Maybe it is, but maybe it's really just a way to make people feel unwelcome, and maybe it's not that big of a danger to the community. But anyway, there's a different dynamic, a similar dynamic, and then an additional one happening in the Hispanic community.
Go ahead, Judith.
Yeah, I mean, adding to this, I had a question about whether there is data that shows how people that don't have a driver's license are actually people that aren't driving well. So, you know, that would give some information on whether it is, you know, that you don't have a driver's license because of immigration status, and therefore you shouldn't be driving because you drive reckless or you don't have that ID.
Yeah, there's a lot of laws that, I think make sense. Like you should have to renew your driver's license every so often. And if you don't renew your driver's license, then there should be a consequence to that. But We do see that I mean, hundreds of thousands of Latinx individuals in North Carolina get arrested for, or cited, not brought into custody, but cited for driving without a valid driver's license. And almost no non-Hispanic people ever get cited for that. It just doesn't happen. And like you mentioned, I don't know if there's any evidence. I don't know of any evidence about that those people are unsafe drivers. And the same is true about the vehicle equipment violations. Driving on bald tires with no working headlights is a public safety hazard. I'm not in favor of that. So, I mean, we have to be careful and use some common sense about, when are we really enhancing public safety by enforcing some of these laws? And when are we using a technical violation of the law or a violation of the law, which isn't really a threat to public safety, as a way to achieve some other goal, which might be a political goal or something else.
Sujata?
Our last meeting, we learned a little bit about some of the implicit bias and other trainings that police are required to do or are able to go to. Were you able to investigate whether those have any effect on some of these disparities?
We haven't been able to investigate that precisely, but I could tell you that in our research, we do know the ID number of every officer in North Carolina. And so we can identify the officers who have particularly disparate patterns of stopping or searching whites and blacks differently. And when we control for that, we still see over and above whatever could be associated with the particular outlier officers, like the stereotypical word is the bad apple police officers. When we control for that, we still see substantial racial disparities. So I think we've overemphasized implicit bias, because you don't have to have any implicit bias to set up roadblocks and checkpoints on the black side of town and then treat everybody fairly. The officer doesn't have to have any kind of bias if the supervisor allocates police patrol, units based on neighborhood. People that live in the neighborhoods that have more police coming through are going to be subjected to more policing. So I think there's both. I mean, I don't want to suggest that we don't have a problem with implicit bias or explicit bias, but I think if we look at institutional practices, we really have to see the wholesale decisions as those systemic decisions made by institutions, where to put the police precincts, where to put the patrol cars, what to emphasize in terms of policing priorities. Those often have large scale impacts. And there's no doubt that the officers at the street level also have an impact, but I think the supervisors and the organizational structures are really important as well. I mean, everything about policing is about neighborhood. It's about place. So there's the high crime neighborhoods, there's the low crime neighborhoods. And if you drive around any cities, you'll see that the high crime neighborhoods in every city are minority and poor neighborhoods. And so if we say we're going to flood those zones with lots of police officers, then the kids that live there are trying to walk to school are going to have that experience that I was referring to earlier, and they're going to end up being alienated from the police. Whereas the kids on the other side of town or in other neighborhoods or other small towns may never see a police officer when they're on their way to school. And if they ever do see a police officer, the officer might be really friendly and you know, without too much to do, and, you know, give them a ride or whatever, you know, have a really positive experience. And so we grow up, I think, in different neighborhoods divided by class and race with very, very different expectations of our interactions with the police. And again, I'm not talking about any particular places. I'm just being generic about the United States. So those decisions about place are very important. And to me, I would think they would overwhelm the factor of implicit bias by the individual officer. Not to suggest that that's not a problem too.
And I'll just add that another part of that conversation that I think is really challenging, not only for police, but for neighborhoods as well, is that within the same neighborhood, you're often going to have people who are saying, we want fewer police in the neighborhood because there's too many encounters with people in our neighborhood that are getting them in trouble. And other people saying, we've got crime in the neighborhood, we want a greater police presence. And so how to navigate that, I think, is really tricky.
Very tricky. And it's also, the police officers often end up in a hard spot because they get called, you know, to intervene in a situation where nobody's broken a law, but where somebody feels uncomfortable for some reason. And they call 911 that there's a suspicious person in the neighborhood or something. And the police have to respond, of course, but then some of those are driven by implicit or explicit bias on the part of citizens. And so it's not only the officers that have to be careful, it's that we have to be careful how we expect our fellow citizens to behave. I did a study of trespassing complaints in a city, and it turns out that the complaints that came from citizens were really racially biased, and the complaints that came from police officers were racially neutral. And that's a problem, but it's a problem that goes well beyond the police agency in question. It's a social problem. It's like the Central Park birding case. And when you think about you talked initially about the death penalty, and I've done a lot of studies about the death penalty, and one of the biggest areas of racial bias in the death penalty is jury decision-making. It's not necessarily the prosecutor or the judge, but it's the 12 jurors. And it's really hard to, you know, fight it, to figure out the solution to that, except cultural change, I guess. I'm always an upper. I always make people so happy when I give my talk, so I can tell I'm having that impact on you.
I would love to ask a somewhat practical question, which is, because this you mentioned it in your talk, and it's come up here in Hillsborough, is that Hillsborough is, you know, we're right by I-85, we're right by I-40. You know, there's really one major path through town from Virginia. You know, everything north of Hillsborough, you've got to come through Hillsborough to get anywhere south of here, more or less. So there is a lot of through traffic. And I guess a question is, though it's frustrating, you can't parse that out necessarily about what's happening with your actual residents. Like, how much does that matter if we're talking about, you know, interactions that lead to, you know, alienation or getting folks caught up in the criminal justice system? And maybe this is an opinion more than a fact question, but how much does that matter in trying to figure out ways to do things differently?
Well, I'm not exactly sure I understand the question. I mean, it wouldn't matter if you know, a young man is racially profiled and he comes from Virginia or New Jersey and he happens to be driving through. That's still the same problem as if he were a local. So that's definitely not an answer to the question. I mean, that's you know, that's an important consideration. It doesn't matter if you're local or not, if you've been unfairly targeted. So, but I'm not sure what your question is exactly.
That maybe I didn't ask it well, because that was what I was driving at, or looking for some kind of affirmation of, I suppose. But I think this has come up before in terms of, you know, where stops happen. What does it mean? Or is it people in this neighborhood or that neighborhood who live in this spot, especially because we're so small, you know, who are actually from here that are being stopped. Maybe I think that's where that's coming from.
Yeah, I mean, we all drive through all kinds of communities all the time. You know, we're crossing over these jurisdictions all the time. So I just feel like every police agency needs to be careful about fairness. I can tell you, though, that if you have out-of-state plates, it's an adverse characteristic nationwide. Every time we've been able to look at a database and it has a variable for out-of-state plates, there's an adverse consequence to those drivers. They're more likely to be searched. And if it's a black driver with out-of-state plates, you know, they're extra super more likely to be searched. And you know, I've always thought that was a funny thing, because in the policing literature, the idea was that there's these drug couriers that are driving around the country transporting drugs. But I'm sure there are, but there's also a lot of people going to visit their grandmother. And so how did we decide that being from out of state, you know, increases the odds that you're involved in criminal activity versus you're visiting family? But we do. I mean, statistically speaking, we associate outsiders with danger. And, you know, I don't know why. There's plenty of good people that live in Virginia, I think. I'm from Michigan. It's not all bad. And so it's, but we do that. But the statistical question you referred to is we call the baseline problem. And that is, who's driving on the roads? And so the people being pulled over should somehow correspond to the people who are driving. So the first thing we do is compare it to the census. But the census isn't a good indicator of, you know, who lives in the neighborhood isn't necessarily the same as who's driving on the highways or the roads. And then who's driving on the roads isn't necessarily an indicator of who's breaking the law. And what we really want to know is who's a serious traffic violation, you know, who's speeding by more than 20 miles an hour, who's really engaging in dangerous driving or something that needs to be pulled over. So in order to do that, what you'd have to do is, you know, that would be a big study. And basically it never happens. But there was a big study of the New Jersey Turnpike where they studied everybody that drove by, and they found, I think, 98% of white drivers were speeding and 97.5% of black drivers were speeding, because everybody was speeding. So there was no racial difference, because breaking the law was ubiquitous across both races. And so once they had that nailed down, they could say, well, the police can pull over whomever they want. And the Supreme Court has made clear that if 2 people or if 1,000 people are violating the law, the police can pick out 3 or 4 out of those 1,000 people at their will. And the fact that other people were breaking the law as well is no defense for the couple unlucky people who got pulled over. If it's a no smoking zone and there's 100 people smoking, the police are not required to arrest all 100 of them. They can pick a few and arrest them. And everybody else is just going to thank their lucky stars that they didn't get arrested, and they're going to get out of there as fast as possible and, you know, be happy they didn't get arrested. The 5 people that do get arrested are going to say, well, that's no fair. You picked me, but you left 95 other people without being arrested. And the police are going to say, well, you're breaking the law. And the judge is going to agree with the police. So that's where we're we are with the traffic code, because everybody is a scofflaw, and that generates kind of a big discretion problem. We just grant absolute discretion to the officers to enforce the law fairly. But we ask them also to go find the drug kingpins and to use the traffic code as a way to do that. And that's just I think, a wasteful strategy of crime fighting.
Well, we are getting close to the end of our time. So are there any other remaining questions folks have in this moment? It's okay if you think of some later.
I have a quick question. Going back to something that Dr. Bumgardner, you said wasn't the biggest problem, but when you said you had data on those outlier officers who were making a lot of what you could determine were racially biased searches or arrests, I'm not sure what that.
Their search rates were vastly different for blacks and whites.
I'm wondering if, like, well, one, what if anything was done with that data, or two, if you could see that those officers were clustered in any area across the state. I mean, was there any higher level analysis of that beyond the identification?
Well, it was about 1/3 of all the officers in the whole state. So, I mean, because the statewide disparity is 2-to-1. So, I mean, you're going to find a lot of officers that have a rate that's more than 2-to-1. I have published on my webpage some spreadsheets that go department by department that list every officer, and some of them have search rates that are 10-to-1. And I think there's been some action taken by some police chiefs about why these officers have such bad statistics. And you have to be really careful with this, because sometimes it's, especially when you get down to one officer at a time, they don't make that many traffic stops. And so the numbers can be fluky when they're small numbers. So I'm always careful with that. But I think that this data collection that the state mandates is a missed opportunity by police supervisors in big departments to use it as part of their performance review to make sure that the numbers for any individual officer are not vastly out of line. And I'm not talking about pulling over more blacks than whites. I'm talking about searching and arresting or finding contraband at different rates on the black and white drivers or Hispanics or males and females. You could be assigned to a neighborhood where you encounter mostly black or Hispanic drivers. And so just looking at that number of people you pull over, I mean, you could be assigned to a mostly white neighborhood and pull over mostly black people, and hopefully your supervisor would know that. I wouldn't know it because I don't know where your assignment is, so I can't really analyze that. But the supervisor certainly could. They would know what neighborhood those officers were assigned to if it's a big city. So I think there is a lot of kind of early warning system built into this data collection on traffic stops that certainly in big police departments, they could review the data as part of their quarterly assessment of every officer or something like that, and look for patterns. It's not hard. I mean, just look at the percent of black drivers that got searched and percent of black drivers that got arrested. Do the same for whites and compare the two numbers. And it's not that then you fire the person. So you use that in the context of other ways of evaluating their performance and see if it's consistent and indicates a problem. It's just an indicator. And so I think it could be used very well by police supervisors with other, in addition to other things. And I think that has happened. I know some police departments have looked at these things. And the Southern Coalition for Social Justice had set up a website where you could do this. And I think it's led to some, lots of attorneys have used it when they have clients that have been brought to court, and they've been able to ascertain who was the officer that pulled them over. And if they had an allegation of racial bias, they could find all the other traffic stops by that officer. And it's led to some legal victories by some defense attorneys. We tell a few stories like that in our book. And there's been a couple of times when there's been some actual significant drug fines, and the cases have been thrown out by the judges because those traffic stop statistics from those sheriff's deputies or police officers were too biased, and they indicated or fit into a story that the defense was able to tell more fully about systematic targeting of black or brown drivers. 80% of all the people pulled over by a certain officer are Hispanic, and they're in Apex or something. I'm making that up. But, if the numbers are really out of line with the local population, then a judge has to interpret that. But that's used in legal cases when there's a defendant who's hires a good attorney who goes to the trouble to do that. But I think police supervisors should be doing that kind of thing. And civil rights advocacy groups, they could do the same thing, get a list of police officers who have bad statistics. And again, these are anonymous numbers, and I've got a lot of them on my webpage, huge spreadsheets for every major top 25 police departments in the state, and lists them all by number. And I don't know who the people are, but their supervisors do.
I think, as you've mentioned, one of the big challenges for this group, I just want to note that, and maybe this is a bit of a segue towards our closing, is that Chief Hampton and Eli have pulled together this pretty, really excellent report that was included in the agenda packet. I don't know, I'll just search for nodding heads. Have people had a chance to take a look at that? It's okay if the answer is no. Okay. Some yeses and nos, it's okay. I want to say thank you to Chief and to Eli for the work that's gone into that report. And I think that really part of kind of the next phase for this group is to take what we have learned from Dr. Bumgardner today and with his presentation, and keep in mind that the numbers, that we have to be careful with the numbers because we are a small jurisdiction, but we can take some of the basic principles and ideas and think about how they apply here to us. Anyway, I'll pause there, but I think that that's kind of the next phase. One
thing that I could say with regards to the small agency issue is we looked at 20 million traffic stops, so we could answer the question, could you explain away the racial disparity by some other factor? Like maybe the black drivers get pulled over more at night compared to the white drivers, or maybe they get pulled over for equipment violations and the white drivers get pulled over for speeding. Maybe these racial disparities are actually, spurious correlations, so to speak. So we analyzed the difference between, or the correspondence between, the simple difference in the search rates and then the most sophisticated statistical multivariate analysis that we could possibly do. And we did it for North Carolina, 20 million. We did it for 30 million traffic stops in the whole state of Illinois, whole state of Maryland. We did some big numbers. And we found that the simple search rate comparison is extremely robust. It's a very useful indicator. If the search rate for black drivers is 10% and the search rate for white drivers is 3%, that's an issue. And it will not be. And I don't know, Hillsborough, I can't guarantee that it wouldn't go away, but statistically, it doesn't get explained away nationwide. in the very large data sets we've looked at, it doesn't get explained away by spurious factors. So it's something that needs to be addressed.
That's super helpful. Thank you. Well, it is just after 9. So in the spirit of our tradition of trying to end on time, we will do that. I will just say deep gratitude and thanks again for joining us tonight. This is extremely valuable, and also really appreciate that last slide that said, happy to answer more questions. We have a lot to stew over, and I would say to the group that if folks have more questions that come up, if you would send them to myself and Eli and to Chief Hampton. I think it would be helpful if we can all kind of see what everybody's thinking about, and we'll kind of compile those over the next, I don't know, couple of weeks. And then, and if we have some, then we'll send them to you. Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Great.
And yeah, and Chief or Eli, if you have questions from inside the police department, you know, I'm happy to help. I know this is, I just appreciate all of you working on this issue, because it ain't easy, and there's no simple solution. So, you know, thank you and good luck.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, I think we can adjourn, and you can look for, you know, some follow-up about what the next steps will be. So thank you everyone for your time, and we will get to those other items on the agenda we didn't get to tonight. I'm glad we gave this all the attention that it needed. I'm just trying to pull up my paper agenda to be sure I'm not missing anything. Well, I'll just say our next meeting date is set for April 8th.